There are four main categories of cuts in our turning world. And the moment you understand their concepts, not only is the result you're going to get off the lathe going to dramatically improve, but your enjoyment of the craft will just explode. And those are basically understanding the planing, peeling, slicing, and scraping that you can do with just about any edge. It all comes down to understanding the interaction between edges and grain. So welcome to Worth the Effort Woodworking as we dive deep into some basic fundamentals of our craft. Now we are going to be talking about the various edges or the various tools that you will collect if you want to get into the craft and be able to do the three basic types of turning we do. Spindle turning, bowl turning, and end grain turning, which is like making boxes and flat cups and stuff like that. We're going to be covering the skews, a roughing, spindle, and bowl gouge, a couple of scrapers, and a parting tool. That is the bare minimum most of y'all are going to collect. But before we get into that, because all of this is just the interaction between edges and fibers, it's probably a good time to talk about grain direction. Now I know a lot of y'all have already had this hammered into your head, but for those of y'all just new to the craft, I'm going to give you a brief explanation and you can go out and get a lot more elsewhere. But real quickly, let's talk about grain direction. For the most part, a tree is made up of long skinny fibers, and the standard analogy is it's like a bunch of straws that are kind of bound together. Unfortunately, the glue between those straws isn't very strong, but the straws themselves are. Have you ever tried to squeeze a straw without bending it in the middle? I mean, there's a lot of strength there. Trees, in compression, have a whole bunch of strength. They are not going to compress down. But you take that straw, lay it on its side, because there's air in between them, you can crush it this way fairly easy. That's why we build houses not by stacking up like a log house. Yeah, they make log houses, but when we cut up the timbers, we don't stack them sideways like that. We put them in compression. And you can see that one when you think of an example of a guy cutting firewoods. He goes out, he wants to chop a tree down. He's going to chop it down sideways. So he comes out, he takes the axe. You can hit that thing as hard as you want, as much as you want, and it's going to be very slow going to get through that tree. Whereas if I just come over here and just take a light hit, it splits really, really easy. Because those fibers were the bond between those fibers is weak. It's why when you cut down a tree, you never strike it straight on. You basically come out at angles, separate the fibers out, and they will break off because the fibers in between the cells are weak. You can practically peel it off once either side is cracked. Now, if you are a follower of Roy Underhill, he talks extensively about how cutting tools can actually work as either a wedge or an edge. When I'm cracking off this blank right here, do you see how the crack is way ahead of the edge? So I'm actually using this axe to split it, and the wedging action is leverage against the grain. Now I can take that same tool and whittle all day long and it won't be splitting. It's just getting a nice smooth cut. And it basically comes down to the difference being whether a fiber is being supported or it's not being supported. Now let's take a flat board, simply because that's the easiest way to explain this concept of supported grain. If I wanted to smooth this out with any kind of sharp edge, I could easily do that one and you get a perfect finish right off the blade, depending upon which direction I am pushing the hand plane. If I were to push my hand plane this way, all those fibers right there are laying each other down. They're pressing each other down. They are being supported on the back side so that you can just slice them off. But if I were to take my hand plane and go the other way, all of a sudden, look at that fiber right there. There's nothing behind it to support it. So it will want to crack along the grain pattern. The only reason why we don't get monster cracks when we are hand planing is because they designed them with the mouth, so that the mouth will kind of hold it down a little bit, but you get a little bit of cracking off, and that's what we call tear out. It is literally tearing the wood fibers out of the board. As an example, I've got a little oak board right here, and you can see that the grain is running from here up to the top. So as we push forward, we are pushing these fibers down if I were to plane in this way. And when you do that one, you get just a glass smooth finish. In fact, you can see the individual cells right there, but it is glass smooth. Now if I were to take that same board and flip it and then rotate it around, so now we are going against the grain right here, watch what happens. Even in the fibers themselves, you can see all the bigger holes, not only the ones that are with the grain, but interspersed throughout it, and there's a lot of sections that are just blown out. All that's to say that if you want a smooth surface straight off a blade, the fibers you are cutting have to be supported behind the cut or in front of the cut. Otherwise, it's just going to break off. It's going to split. Now, we do take advantage of that weakness, that splitting aspect, all the time in turning. It comes down to whether using your edges as wedges or edges. Now, all woodworking, with maybe the exception of laser cutters, which follows rules more in line with science fiction, is based off of the simple edge. If you're a grain woodworker, the simplest form of that would probably be the axe. If you are a furniture maker, you're probably looking at a chisel, and on the lathe, you're most definitely looking at the skew. It is the simplest in design tool there is that you use, and because it is so simple, a straight edge, it has a lot more flexibility. You can do more with a single chisel than you can do with just about any other tool out there. It can be used almost as a hand plane, a saw, a drill, whatever you need it to do, it can accomplish. It might not be the most efficient or fast, but it can get the job done. The same with the skew. It is a straight edge. All other tools are based on it. So let's take a quick look at how the skew can interact with wood. Now with the skew, you are able to plane wood, just like a hand plane. You're able to peel wood. You are able to slice wood, and you are able to scrape wood. Each one of those not only created different shavings, but they gave you different results, and they interacted with the wood in a different manner. Let's go back to planing. Now, right now we are doing what's called spindle turning. In that, it's a lot like hand tool woodworking where we have a flat board. We took a tree, we laid it on its side, and now we're just rotating it around the axis. So when we are taking in consideration supported grain, going with the grain, well, we can kind of look at it like a board. We have grain running straight across the piece, as you can see. Hopefully that's how you got it from the tree. Right here, all that grain running straight across. Now, as long as I am cutting down towards the center of the spindle in that direction, notice those fibers. They're all being laid down. They're being pressed down. It is all supported grain. But the moment I try to cut what they call uphill and turning, all of a sudden, look at that fiber right there. I'm basically lifting it out so it will tear out. So when you're planing, the key thing is you always want to go towards the center of the spindle when you're spindle turning, because it's laying fibers down. Now real quickly, I do want to analyze the edge of my skew a little bit more, because when I explain how all the other tools, I'm using this as a reference. Now you might notice that my skew has somewhat of a curved profile when you look at it, and that's a little bit straight, and then it curves down and then comes down, and then you have your bevel coming off like that. Don't worry about that. everybody kind of prefers a slightly different shape, whether it is straighter across or straighter down, or maybe some people like them straight across and then curved down, some straight. That's somewhat irrelevant for what we are discussing today. What I want you to focus on is the angle, the edge of it. Now, most everybody I know in the modern world sharpens their tools on some kind of grinder, so you get a somewhat concave one. Skews, I know a lot of people that will hand sharpen because they want them dead flat. But dead flat or slightly concave, it's kind of the same in the modern day world. I do not know anybody that does a convex style. Now, when you grind it on a grinder, what most of the time happens is you'll get an 8-inch curve right here, kind of like that. And obviously I'm exaggerating. That doesn't really matter, because most people will hone their skews on some kind of stone just really quickly. And having that curve right there means when you touch these 2 points, right here and right here, you get the desired angle you're going for, and the interaction with the wood, that's going to be the angle you're working with. The curve kind of disappears in real world applications. But because you hone it with a flat stone, these 2 points are going to be in plane. So when you examine my skew, you might see a glint of light reflecting here and on the edge. And that's where I have honed both sides by taking my stone and kind of rocking off the bottom and then bringing it forward until it just touches the tip. It totally overskips the center section, which is ground. You can see the grind marks. And that just means that I'm removing less material on both ends, which you have to do it on both sides to sharpen it. It makes the honing at the lathe a lot easier. It also gives me 3 points I have to focus on, because in order to make a planing cut, I have to have this, and something on my tool rest touching. Now, a hand plane works properly because it has a sole. You see, as you shove a plane through the wood, the blade itself wants to dive in. It catches, it dives in. But because it's locked in this, and there's a sole there, the sole prevents the blade from going in, so you get the shavings coming out. Without that sole, a plane would not work properly. And oh, cool. Look right here. I have all the grain coming this way, except for right here where it reversed ever so slightly. Talking about that tear out, because the grain is now unsupported here. Can you see that tear out? Well, turning tools work the same exact way, except for having an entire plain sole. All we have are these bevels. These bevels work as a sole. And if I'm planing something long and straight, I'm actually gliding this bevel on the wood, and this edge wants to dive into the wood. But this one prevents it from diving too far forward. If I did not have this edge in, this would dive in and you would get what's called a catch. So whenever I'm working with this plane, you will see me, I will touch the tool rest always to the tool rest first. I will touch that bevel down to the wood, and then I will rotate it over, and I'm going to engage the wood on the blade about 1/3 of the way up. Now I'll explain that why in a second. And then, because this back bevel and this bevel are both touching, I have control with my tool handle as for how far deep it goes. But if for some reason I were to twist too far and that back bevel comes off, the blade itself wants to dive in and we get what's called a catch. I cannot control it if I don't have that back bevel on there controlling how far in the blade wants to dive. I also want you to grasp this idea of the supported cut. Let me clear this off real quickly so we can get a nice smooth finish. But once again, touch the tool rest, touch that bevel down, and maintain a forward motion while I'm cutting. Touch, twist till it engages, move across. Touch, twist, move. Now, what you also saw was that the wood was coming off the gouge at about 45 degrees. See, I'm centering it right here. 45 degrees is a kind of a general angle that you're going to find useful for a lot of different wood turning tools or any woodworking tools. So I'm going to touch that bevel down, twist into it, and engage it right about there. But I want you to notice, if I'm engaging it there, look at where it's touching the tool rest, because I actually had to twist this side off to engage the blade. That is what's called a supported edge of the cut, because the force is coming. Now, I didn't explain this very well when I did this, so I'm going back to edit it real quickly, but what I wanted to talk about was a supported cut. You see the shavings are coming across right there. The bevel itself is touching right there. My direction is going this way, so if you form this triangle between direction, cutting edge, and stuff like that, that is a supported cut. If I were to touch the tool on either edge, right there, it would be too far out of the supported range, and it would want to torque the tool one way or the other, causing a catch. Coming straight back into the tool rest. If I were to twist it a little bit farther off of that, it'll want to catch, and if I twist it a little bit farther this way, the nose is going to dive in and I'm going to get a catch that way. So you want to basically work off the bottom edge of your tool, because the tool is rotated this way. And the last little nugget when you're planing is you must never stop. If you're planing along, taking a nice shaving, getting forward momentum, the moment you stop, that's when it's going to want to dig in and track. It's that forward momentum which keeps you getting nice smooth shavings. Don't stop. It'll track back on you. So in review, a planing cut, we are basically always going with the grain by going towards the center of the wood. That is laying those fibers down. They tend to come off the blade at about 45 degrees because that's how the angle that they are presenting it. And the shavings themselves are going to look like shavings you would get from a hand plane. Nice long curly cues. Now let's look at a peeling cut. The peel is probably one of the most underappreciated cuts in turning, simply because it can waste away so much material so quickly, and then you can go to other cuts to refine it. And why do I say that? Well, let's look at the end result. Nothing about this cut is refined. You see all this tear out on the end. That's because we were basically splitting the wood. We're taking advantage of the weakness of the wood going up and down the tree. That's why it is so fast. It's like when I was splitting the board with the axe. You could take off huge chunks at the same time. And if you look at the shavings we got off, each one of these is a long fiber going off up and down. And they split incredibly easy. There's nothing really holding these long ribbons together. In fact, I have some planing shavings right now, and I have some peeling shavings. If I were to just take my hand and scrunch them up like that, all that's really left are the planing shavings, because all the peeling shavings just fall apart. And because we are splitting the wood, all the fibers are unsupported. So as you're going down this direction, see, they're just all torn out. That is not a smooth cut at all. Now a peeling cut is actually taking advantage of the weakness of the wood. It is more like splitting the tree, splitting a piece of firewood, going with the grain, and causing those straws to separate out. That's what we were looking at there. But the thing is, the tools we are using, we don't want them to dive in too fast. So if I have my turning blank, and it is rotating around this way, I have my tool rest right here, okay? And then I have my skew. And remember, my skew has two bevels on it and a curve. So I have the top bevel, bottom bevel, the grinding curve right there, so that these 2 points right here are in line. Well, when I was planing, this back bevel is what controlled the depth. I don't have that option this time, because this curve right here is a lot smaller than the 8 inches on my grinder. So really the only part of my tool that is going to be touching is going to be this tip right there. Luckily, that tip has a flat caused by my honing action. So I can use the back section of that tip as my depth control. Now, one issue a lot of people have is they would just take that edge going toward the center and they think that they touch it and they dive straight down. That's not really the case. Because we're dealing with circles, you actually have to arc into the center. So what you'll a lot of times do is you'll start the arc forward, come down right here, and when you get closer it goes a little bit straighter. It's just the real world aspect of turning. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to try and go fairly slow when I'm peeling it. I want you to watch the arc. I'm actually matching this bevel to the curve right there and using that back section as my depth control to take nice thin straws coming off, not big huge chunks. So with the peel, I'm going to be presenting the top of my skew so it's in line with the center axis, so I'll get a nice flat surface. I'm going to start up high, I'm going to touch that bottom bevel, then I'm going to raise it up until I see shavings coming off. But if you notice, at that point, my back bevel is in the air. I'm just controlling the depth of my cut with the bottom of that front edge where I flattened it out. And from here, I'm going to push forward. Now, if anything bad happens, I push too far forward, I just go into air. No big deal. I can back up until I see shavings and push forward again. And I'm going to arc towards the center of the blank. Once again, touch, lift down, see shavings, arc towards the center of the blank. If I arc a little bit deeper, I get bigger shavings. Now I can also take fine shavings. It all depends upon how far down you're letting your edge dive. But once again, the surface that leaves, because we were splitting and not going with the grain, is just atrocious. Now the next cut we're going to do is a slice. And this is similar to how a saw cross-cuts a board. I'm going to come up, I'm going to place the tip, and the motion is still going to be the same as when I peeled. I'm going to kind of move forward and down towards the center. And I'm just going to take off a very edge. Whoops. Slice my way down. And the advantage of this cut is the end result is going to be very, very smooth, almost finish ready. The tip of my tool is probably a little dull right now, but that's a slicing action. Now a slicing cut is also taking advantage of the weakness of the wood, because once you separate those fibers, remember there's not much holding those long straws together once you cut them in half. And if I cut it close enough, the angle of my skew on this side will kind of shove those excess fibers off. So I've severed them, and then the wedging action pushes it off to the side. So here we go. Once again, I'm going to start up high. I'm using this side of my bevel to align perfectly straight. I touch it, knowing about how much of the wood I will be able to remove. Now that's the kicker, because if I come over a little bit too far over, if I push in, well, there's too much resistance on this side. There's more meat there, there's more support there, so I cannot continue going. The wood's going to fight me back. I can only take off enough so that the natural motion of the wood will separate off. And this is actually how you make V-cuts, is coming from either side in the direction you're doing. You're just taking off enough so that the outside will sever off. But when you need your end grain to be finished ready, there really isn't much that's going to beat the results you're going to get by slicing that end grain. Scraping is the last cut, and what's unique about that is it happens at a negative angle. Let me explain. For the most part, when you're cutting wood, you're cutting it at a somewhat laid back angle, so it's positive right there on the angle, so that the blade actually wants to dive into the wood, and you have the sole preventing it back, as we discussed earlier, and that's how you get those nice curly shavings. But what's different is when you are scraping, you're not cutting with an edge, you're cutting with a burr, and a burr is a little bit piece of metal that has been rolled off of the edge, so it's somewhat curved up, so you actually have to roll forward in order for it to be positive to engage. And what happens is that burr engages into the wood, the shavings come up and hit the plate and just roll over, and that becomes your depth stop because it's not going to want to go any deeper. So whenever you're using a scraper, you basically lean it forward to engage that burr or the edge, and you can go forward like that and get nice shavings. And what's cool about this is you can go in any direction because it's not going to be diving into the wood. It's not going to be breaking fibers off because they're actually getting crushed against this plate. So scraping with your turning tools is the same exact thing. You just got to present the edge in a negative angle. You don't necessarily have to have a burr on it because we have a lot more speed in our favor, but it has to be at a negative angle. Now, a lot of people, when they see somebody do this with a skew, they think, oh, they're going in a positive angle, because we are presenting the skew going up, and the rotation of the piece is coming around this way, so it looks positive. But you have to understand the top edge of that is just ever so slightly below the horizon. It is going down a little bit to engage that negative angle. And how far down kind of affects the shavings that are going to be coming off. So as I present my tool to the edge, I'm looking at this angle. I'm presenting it not horizontally, but slightly negative to the wood, and I will get nice shavings. Scraping like shaving. Much like those that we were getting with the card scraper. They're flying away in the air. But they're not those long strings that we would get in either of the times we are peeling or planing. Now you can scrape in any direction. I am now scraping the face. And a lot of people would use that effect. Now I'm now scraping straight end grain. And you can get ribbons when you're scraping end grain, but those ribbons are just the little calamari of the cells, and they will crush away into sawdust if you squeeze them together. Now I will say this, scraping is the quickest way to dull your tool, okay? The general rule of thumb I go by is you've got about 8 seconds in any one spot of your grain. So I've been scraping right about 8 seconds now, and guess what? I'm not getting any shavings off. My tool is now dull and I need to resharpen it. And the surface you're going to get when you scrape kind of depends upon what kind of fibers you're doing. Right now when I'm scraping this end grain right here, well, those fibers are somewhat supported right there, so I can get a fairly smooth surface on end grain. But as I transition to long grain right here, notice the difference between planed and scraped. The color difference, we've got microscopic tear all over the place, and some plots where it's just really, really rough. Because as you're rotating on, those fibers, well, once again, they're weak this way, and if you're severing them all the way across, not only is it going to be rough where the initial break is, but right here it's not going to be soothed because they were basically split off on a cellular level and not planed off. So in a review, all of these cuts took advantage of the different aspects of how the edge interacted with grain. I will only consider 2 of them to be finish cuts. Something that you could go straight from the tool and apply wax or oil or whatever and be done with it. And those would be the planing and the slicing. Because in both of those cases, the fibers that were left behind were supported before the cut, so you got a nice surface. When I was peeling, I'm dramatically taking advantage of the weakness of the wood and basically just breaking it off. And for the most part, I'm doing the same when I'm scraping, unless I'm going scraping straight into end grain. Anytime you do any kind of angle off of that end grain, you're now kind of on a cellular level, kind of scraping away unsupported fiber. So it's not going to be the perfect finish, but it will be good enough that you could probably start with 220 or 320 grit sandpaper and be done with it from there. So now that we understand how those 4 cuts, plane, peel, slice, and scrape, can all happen with a straight edge, let's look how this edge relates to the other tools. And I want to start with the spindle roughing gouge. Now, side note, the entire industry is really trying to get people to use the term spindle roughing gouge with this tool because it is only designed to work with spindles. You do not want to work it with face plates or face grain for like bowls or hollowing boxes or anything like that. It's just not designed for that. It's completely safe for spindles, but not for bowls and such like that. And I go into that quite a bit in depth in some of my other educational videos on bowls and boxes and stuff like that. And it all comes down to the design of the tang, the shaping, and that kind of stuff. Now, what makes this tool so cool is it is probably the best tool we have for wasting away material in spindles, because remember me talking about peeling and it being the most underrated cut? This tool is basically a straight edge that's been rolled. If I aim it up like this, you can see that it is completely straight right there. It's only curved because they rolled it up. So they've basically taken a skew and just rolled up the edges. As such, this can really only be presented one way to woodworking. And that's with the blank coming this way and it presented straight on. Because if you turn it sideways, your edges are going to catch and you can get a catch. And that brings me back to that supported edge. We are now looking somewhat down on my lathe. Here's a tool rest, here's a tool blank. When you have a somewhat round tool, this might be a bowl gouge or a spindle gouge or something like that, when you present the tool to the wood, the supported part is a part where the tool is resting on the tool rest. So that bottom section of this U right now is now supported. And I can make shavings. If for any reason whatsoever I were to touch these sides right here, they will dig in because the support is right there and torque around. So the only spot that's ever supported on a round tool, even if it might be canked over, is a spot right underneath where the tool is on the tool rest. So this is completely safe for me. This is completely safe for me, and so is that. But if I were to be here and try and engage a side, all of a sudden it will want to torque around. It's much more prevalent on spindle and bowl gouges. But if you notice, there's really no way for me with this tool to present it at much more than 45 degrees. This tool is the premier tool for wasting away material on a spindle gouge, on a spindle turning, because it basically peels but slices both sides. Now, if you remember, whenever I peeled with my skew, I basically came off the edge and half of the work was free. But this edge over here, because I was ripping the fibers off from the end, it's just all torn up. The advantage of the round section is I'm actually touching the wood with a U, and as such, I'm actually severing the fibers on either side before I peel it up. So I can actually do that one, this peeling cut, anywhere on the blank. I don't have to do it just on the side. So, notice the difference. This is me peeling with a skew, and the surface is it left nice and flat because the skew tool itself was flat. But the difference was it's all ragged on the edges, and this is one for the pecan, but you got long shavings of those fibers that were just basically the straws lightly held together. Whereas with the spindle roughing gouge, you get these U's all the way across because the bottom of the tool was rounded. But what that meant is it severed the fibers on either side and peeled away the middle. And you ended up getting those same kind of cross-grained peels, but now they're more like Frito chips. They're thicker in the middle and thinner on the sides because it feathered out. That's why you could use that spindle roughing gouge anywhere along the surface, whereas I was only comfortable using the skew on the edge. As I said earlier, the peel is probably the most underrated cut we have. And the spindle roughing gouge is so efficient at roughing away material and getting square stock down around, removing bark and stuff like that, because all it does is peel, but it has the advantage of slicing a little bit on either side because of these wings coming up. It's kind of like taking the skew and going think, think, and then think like that, and allows you to peel anywhere on a log. I also like this one because it's probably the easiest tool to sharpen, because all you do is you put it on a 40-degree platform and just go brrr, brrr, like that. There's no jigs, there's no nothing. So this is the tool that most of us use to waste away all the material we want and then refine it with the other tools, because it doesn't really matter if we dull this one quite a bit. It takes seconds to resharpen, where the other ones might take a little bit more skill and a little bit more time to do. Now let's talk about the other curved tools, the spindle gouge and the bowl gouge. And I'm grouping these two together and separating out this round tool because this is polar opposite of those two. Because it doesn't have any wings that were swept back. Remember, it's slicing on the sides and peeling in the middle. Well, these two, the wings are come back. That's why they call it a fingernail grind, because it kind of looks like your fingernail. Well, instead of slicing on the sides, you basically slice with the tip on these two and either peel or plane with the sides. Exactly opposite of that roughing gouge, which is why you can use these on a lot of other different types of turning, such as end grain and bowl turning. Not only that, but it's also generally much thicker metal. So let's take a closer look. Now everybody shapes their spindle and bowl gouges for their preferences. There's lots of different styles. This is kind of a fingernail grind on both of things with swept back wings. Some people will sharpen their bowl gouges, you know, slightly come back, but almost like the roughing gouge, just slightly recessed. Others will have their wings coming way, way back. All of that has different advantages and disadvantages. It's just kind of personal preference, but that's irrelevant for what we're discussing today. Today I want to focus on what's actually happening at the fiber and the edge. Now the difference between a spindle and a bowl gouge is mainly the flute depth, because if you notice on this one, the flute only goes about 1/3 of the way down, where on the bowl gouge it goes almost 2/3 of the way down. And that gives you different aspects to the interior angle that's happening with the exterior angle, and the surface area you can touch with the gouge. Now, I want you to look at this. Right now, if I turn this spindle gouge just slightly sideways, can y'all see a similarity here between that and this skew? I mean, basically, we have a straight edge coming straight up here. It is somewhat straight. Even though it's a curve, it's pretty straight right there with these swept back wings. Can y'all see that? Very similar. And even the angles, when I got this hoe, it's coming straight up, and this side, when it's coming straight up, this side right here is really similar. Same with the bowl gouge. I present it so that the side bevel that I've sharpened is straight up and down, and then I position the same with my skew. Can y'all see that? Real similarities. And the bowl gouge, because this is what they call a parallelogram bowl gouge, where it comes fairly straight down the sides and then the U's and then straight up. It's not a true U. I I get a much straighter interior surface right there. So it itself acts a lot more like a straight skew. Whereas in the tip of it, if I were to rotate that all the way over, can y'all see? With the wood slicing up and down, coming past it up and down, that tip is very similar to the tip of my skew. Now, when you're using these rounded tools like this, basically it is a left hand and right hand tool. If you draw a line right down the middle, and I'm going to just cover half of it in black and leave the other half clear, well, you basically have your right hand side and your left hand side. So anytime you're cutting in the right hand direction, you're going to be leaning the tool so that that right hand wing is lower, and you're cutting off of the lower wing. You never cut off the upper wing. So going left hand direction, I would either rotate the tool and either present the wing or the tip going in that direction, always cutting off of the lower wing. So we are back at the lathe, and I want to do a straight peel with my skew. I start high, I come down to these shavings, I push forward in an arc, okay? Look at the end results. I have a very ragged edge, lots of torn fibers in here, but over here it's straight, but it's not exactly smooth because I split this center sections off. So now I'm going to take my bowl gouge, okay? Using this edge right here, just as I did the skew, I'm going to present it to the wood. I'm going to lift up. The wood is coming into that edge at a straight angle, and I'm just going to peel it down. Start, lift, peel my way down. Let's look at the difference. I still get the straight across here, and it still has the minor tear-outs every now and then because I was splitting those fibers. But now look at this. Look at how smooth that end grain. I don't have the torn fibers here. That's because at this angle, this tip of the tool was trailing ever so slightly behind. This area was planing, and at that very tip right there, it was slicing those fibers. So if I come back with my skew, and now I'm going to slice just about halfway down so that you can see the comparison to see that they are practically identical. Come back in, come up, line my bevel, slice down. And look at the results. Very, very similar in smoothness. Maybe a little bit rougher on the bowl gouge. The bowl gouge is probably a little dull, but you get the idea. Now, I can do the same exact thing with my spindle gouge, but remember me talking about the different angles we had when we presented these because the bowl gouge flute was deeper, thus making this interior angle a little bit steeper. That's not as deep in relation to the bevel I have right here. Thus, it's not as much peeling as it is scraping whenever I get it to the point where I want the tip to be the front section of it. Remember, on the bowl gouge, the tip was trailing behind a little bit. This time, it is leading. So I can come over here, I'm lining my bevel up of my tool in a straight line. This angle right here is coming back at about 45 degrees, but it's not peeling or planing at that angle because this right here is negative to the wood, more like a scraper. So I come back in, enter, peel. Now it's coming through. We are getting nice clean cuts on the end grain. You can see all this tear out right here because instead of peeling, it was scraping, which is a lot rougher. But watch this. I was taking the thin shavings because that's exactly like the skew could do, because remember there was resistance on this side. But with both of these tools, I can now all of a sudden take much bigger shavings coming off. Because not only is it slicing the end grain like it did with the skew, but this section is getting rid of that, not just using that wedging action of the other bevel of my skew. In fact, in bowl turning, that is such a cool aspect. It's why a lot of people will use their bowl gouge in place of a skew when wasting away material, because they can get that clean end grain by leading with a tip, not leading with the wing this time, leading with the tip, lining my bevel, and I can take huge cuts. And this is definitely peeling, not scraping. Look at that angle that I'm using. And compare the finish. Now this finish is not perfect. You do see some tear out right there because I was getting really aggressive and really fast with it. It's one of those situations that the more you rotate up, so that the more you're engaging the peeling action of the bowl gouge, it somewhat reduces where the tip is. The tip actually flows behind that peeling cut. Whereas if I rotate forward a little bit, the tip leads. So I'm severing the fibers first, but all of a sudden this now becomes a negative angle, so it's just scraping. So if I do that one, it's a lot slower. The peeling is a lot faster than scraping. But look at the end result, okay? I'm going to start out, I am scraping, slicing first, then scraping. I rotate it around, now I'm peeling first and scraping second. And you should be able to tell a pretty big difference in that the, well, oh, there we go. In that the lower section has tear out because it was cutting the fibers and they were no longer supported because they were already peeled away, whereas when I was rotated forward, the tip severed the fibers first and then peeled them away second, so that those fibers were supported. So that's peeling and scraping using that lower wing of both of those curved tools, the spindle and bowl gouge. So now let's go back to planing. With planing, I am touching my tool to the tool rest, I'm touching the lower bevel, I'm rotating in, and I'm moving forward. And if at all possible, I'm moving more towards the center of the wood so that I'm laying those fibers down. Okay? The end result is a somewhat smooth finish that you could probably hit with 220 right away and be done with it. The key thing was the wood is rotating this direction straight into the blade, like that, and the blade itself is coming right around 45 degrees, so that it hits at that 45 degree angle. Well, we can do the same exact thing with our bowl gouge, and because that interior angle and the exterior angle is roughly the same as the skew, everything should work out. So I touch the tool to the tool rest, I touch a lower bevel down, I rotate in, and right about when I see it engage, I start moving the chisel. Now I personally do not like doing it this way because I actually cannot see the cutting edge when I'm standing right behind it, because this wing is covering up the cut angle because I'm having to rotate so much farther forward. But look at the end result. Nice, smooth. It's actually a little bit smoother than the skew because this angle is coming farther down like that, so it's even more supported. But you can plane with the bowl gouge. The wood doesn't actually know the difference. It just knows that a blade is being presented to it at 45 degrees, it's going downhill, so all the fibers are being supported. And just to show it's possible, here is my spindle gouge. Once again, touch, lift, move. I find this one's easier because the interior angle of the flute isn't as great, so I can actually see the edge where I'm standing. The downside is my distance between the bevel, back of the bevel and the front edge is so much shorter on this tool than it is my bowl gouge that you can see the undulations. It's a little bit harder to control a straight line. That's what makes just a standard skew so great, because there's a longer distance, so it's easier to make a straight line. That doesn't mean that a standard skew can only plane, only slice, or only peel. You can actually transition from one into the other. And it's easily demonstrated if you're rolling a bead. Because a lot of times people will either use the lower tip in a start out slicing manner and just roll it around like that. Or I will typically plane my way around and just slowly start removing material. And you will end up in a final position in a somewhat slicing cut. You roll it around, and see, now I'm slicing off of the edge, okay? And you'll get that nice transition of a bead. Well, a spindle gouge can do the same exact thing. You can actually start out planing and then rotate in to a slice. Or you can come in this way, rotate it around into a slice. I'm working around the camera so my lines aren't as smooth. You can even, what you can do with this that's a lot harder on a standard skew, is I can start out with a slice and end up in a plane and make a cove. Slicing wood off the tip, coming back down, transitioning to the lower part of the blade, and planing. And when you get that, you get the transition of the smooth finish of the slice to the smooth finish of planing supported grain. So you can start out with your 220 grit. I just can't emphasize enough. Wood is stupid. It was stupid when it was alive. It's stupider now that it is dead. It can only interact with the guidelines that nature set with it. It's going to be really strong on the end grain because of compression. So we have to kind of slice that in order to get a good result. Otherwise, it's going to split and break because it breaks along its weakness, going up and down. So, slicing and planing generally gives you a supported cut. So you're going to get a great finish. But peeling and scraping generally don't. Those are unsupported cuts most of the time. So you get that rougher edge because the wood just broke off. Now, I want to throw some curves at you. We've only been talking about spindles. Now let's talk about end grain hollowing. The third, one of the three kinds of turning we commonly do, and that's like when you're making boxes or cups or something like that. Now, when you're spindle turning, working with the grain so that you're always cutting supported fibers is fairly simple. I mean, just a second ago, we had our blank. I had a live center on one side, and then I had the drive center on the other, and the grain was running straight. So anytime I wanted to cut a supported fiber, I just worked towards the center. I could work towards the center this way, coming in this way, working off that way. But in each one of these cases, when I removed the wood, the fiber underneath of it was always supported by more wood. I would have never cut this way, because that fiber, whenever I cut it, there was nothing above it to support it. So it would have broken off. It would have been, the weakness of the wood would have gotten us tear out and a crack and maybe even a little bit of a catch. But we are about to go the end grain turning route. So we are not going to be coming from the outside anymore. We have to somehow hollow out the middle. So maybe we can make a chalice, a cup, a box, or something like that. And if you notice, if I were to start from the outside and come in this way, that fiber right there, there's nothing here to support it. It is unsupported. So think about that. What direction do you have to do if instead of working from the outside in, we are now going from the inside out. Well, I think it's pretty self-evident. We now have to start from the center and work our way out to hollow, because working this way, these fibers are supported in the cut. There's something behind it preventing it from breaking out, from getting tear out. But I have a second kicker that I don't think you thought about. And this kicker is going to totally eliminate one of the tools we're going to be using. So I want you, as I describe it, I want you to be thinking, what tool can we no longer really use effectively? You see, when you're spindle turning, you have the log in front of you and it is spinning toward you. So in effect, the rotation or the movement is in a straight line towards you. But we are now taking that straight log and we're turning it on its side, and we're going to anchor it on one side so that we can come in on the end of the tree. So the rotation is now in a curve. So whenever we hit the wood, it's not coming, the movement isn't going straight down, it's curving all the way around. Because of that, we have one tool that has an absolutely straight edge. So no matter how you touch it, it's going to want to, that tool wants to interact with wood in a straight line most of the time, unless we're talking about the skew. Because if I were to touch the tip or the edge, it's just going to want to launch off, and because of the curve, it's going to want to move. So traditionally, we don't use a skew in end grain turning, but we're still going to use the same four cuts: the plane, the peel, the slice, and the scrape in end grain turning. We're just using the other tools to do it. Now I'm going to start our discussion about end grain work by revisiting scraping. So, quick refresher. A scraper is basically a straight edge, and we present it at a negative angle to the wood, meaning we've tilted it down a little bit. And that will engage a burr, which is a little bit of metal that's been rolled over the edge. And that burr is the cutting edge, so that the shavings come down, they hit the thing, and they flake off. Now, when we were spindle turning, meaning when we were coming in from the side of the tree, well, that was more of a, even though it's scraping, it's a peeling cut. So we don't get the best finish we can. Okay? You can see it. It'll be all torn out, but it is very easy to shape it with sandpaper after the fact. Now, when we were coming into end grain, well, we were getting nice shavings because at that point in time, we are no longer peeling it. We are actually slicing it. You see, when we were slicing, we were actually cross-cutting that end grain. Well, if that burr is actually coming right over here and the wood's coming across, we are in fact slicing. And we get the same kind of shavings we would over there. But you notice, because on this scraper right here, it's curved, I'm basically slicing up front to get a finish over here, but the side, because it's coming at an angle, it is more planing. So right in the dead center, I get those slicing kind of shavings that are short, kind of broken off, but the more I come out to the side, I start getting longer shavings as if I was peeling. Right in the middle, coming straight across, I am slicing. Notice the shavings. The more I come out to the side and it's presenting it as an angle, I'm more planing at that angle. Now the same thing is true with my spindle gouge. I can present it straight on in, and that tip is going to be scraping, thus slicing those side fibers. But notice this wing right now, instead of scraping at a negative angle, all of a sudden it's at a positive angle, much like as if I were taking the skew from the inside of the tree going to the outside. And you can get those kind of skew shavings. So I just present it in the middle, and notice the kind of shavings I'm getting. Notice the angle I'm presenting the tool to the wood. I need to lower my tool rest a little bit. So I go in, so I place the spindle straight in, scrape that tip, I bring it out, the angle out to the side, so now this wing right here is kind of planing at about that 45-degree angle. You see, even though I changed the orientation of the grain this time, I didn't change my tools, all the rules still apply. You just have to think it through. Now, I typically don't use a bowl gouge on here, but I do know a lot of people that do. I just like the lower angle brought upon by the lower flute of the spindle gouge. And most of my hollowing I will do with a spindle gouge until it gets fairly deep, and then I can't get the angle I like, the upward angle, so that I get the planing, that 45 degrees. At that point, the rest of my end grain hollowing is just pure scraping, because the scraper at that point can do the slice and the plane that gives me a good result because those cuts are supported. And now it's time to throw you for a real loop. Face grain work. You see, with face grain work, we have additional problems brought about by grain. You see, in spindle work, you take your tree, you lay it on your side, and you rotate the tree around. Okay? Fairly simple. To go with the grain, you go towards the center. And on end grain hollowing, basically we're just coming out from the center to the middle. That is always laying fibers down either way you go. But now we're going to take that tree and we're going to turn it end over end. So the question becomes, how do you lay fibers down? Well, in profile, it kind of makes common sense. You have your bowl right here. Well, in some directions, if you are turning from the top and moving down this way, all those fibers are laying down. But if I did the same thing up here, those would be tearing out. So on the inside of the bowl, it makes sense to start from the outside and work my way toward the center. But from the outside of the bowl, it makes sense to work from the center and go to the outside. But we have a problem. At this entry level right here, it could be going either direction, just depending upon how the tree grew. So you have to kind of think about everything. But in this situation, it's not 2D. You're just not going towards the center coming out. We now have grain that's running up and down like this, and it's rotating. So at some points around the rotation, if you're turning, you're going now against the grain, because if this is hollowed out towards the middle, all of a sudden those fibers right here and right here, there's nothing behind them. It's open air. Those are going against the grain, whereas here and here, you're going with the grain. So coming with the bowl turning or faceplate turning, where you're turning the tree end over end, you are constantly having to go with the grain against the grain, with the grain against the grain, even in the situations where you are going with the grain. Confusing, ain't it? So in faceplate turning, where we are always turning as the wood's coming down on us, you just kind of do the best you can. You know, at a couple points in each one, see the grain is running right here. If I cut in this direction, it is being laid down. But when I come back over on this side, over here, that is going against the grain. That fiber right there will kind of break off. So more than likely, I'm going to be getting tear out here and here whenever I turn this bowl. But I would be definitely getting tear out all over the place if I started from the center and came out from the inside of the bowl, because the grain of the tree itself is running fairly straight. It's got a little curve to it, but it's fairly straight. So coming this direction from the outside of the bowl, this is laying fibers down, but from the inside of the bowl, that is laying the fibers down. So it's one of those things, you do the best you can You can either go totally against a grain, or you can do the best you can and just be against a grain 25% of the time on these opposite corners. Or you could just scrape the whole thing, because if you remember, scraping kind of ignores grain direction, but it will never get you a finished ready surface, or even one where you can start at 220, 300, or 400. You're going to have to go really deep with your sandpaper to get rid of all the tear out that it induces, because it induces minor amounts of tear out, whereas going against a grain in certain sections can produce major amounts of tear out. And the way to avoid that is do all your turning and then resharpen your tool at the last pass, because the sharp tool will kind of negate most tear out. But it also comes back to how you're using your tool. Are you planing, peeling, slicing, or scraping? Those easy wood tools are really popular because you don't have to worry about any of this. You just deal with the scraping and sand it all out. That has its positive and minuses, speed being the biggest minus in my opinion. So, as you work a bowl, generally what we're going to be doing, as always, you're going to be working on the bottom wing of whatever you're doing, but most of the time with a bowl gouge, you're going to be leading with the tip, because we are having to do with end grain right here, long grain right there, end grain, long grain. And if you are to plane end grain, you're going to get a lot of tear out. But if you were to slice end grain, it's a smooth cut. If you were to slice long grain, you get a smooth cut, but it's kind of slow. If you were to plane long grain, you also get a nice cut, but it's a lot faster. So it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't. Most of us choose to slice the long grain for a slower cut, but get a smooth cut all the way around. So here's what I do. I will start in the center, work my way out, leading with a tip, planing with the bottom wing, and you get these long shavings because it is a planing cut. This diameter right here is planing into the wood. The tip of the tool touches to slice the fibers. That makes a little shoulder that the tool itself can press against, so that the planing action comes along. Notice where the bevel is on the tool. It is in line so that I am now planing, coming through. I have the tool mainly closed, meaning the flutes are parallel with the ground, to slice that initial wall. Whoops, see that skate back? Remember me saying that you couldn't really use a skew on a round surface because it moves? Well, if I'm slicing with that tip, it's acting like a skew. If I don't have support on the back side, that skew, because it's turning in a circle, will go with it. That's called skating. You can skate one way or the other. It's mainly this direction that happens. So what we do is we kind of put a little back pressure with our hands so that we can establish a wall, so that it wants to skate back, but that wall is there. And then we can rotate the tool so we get the planing action, so we get our nice planing shaving. Establish that wall by slicing those end grains. We're also slicing long grain, and then planing to get the shavings. And notice I'm doing this at a slight angle so that I'm going with the grain. So that now I can come back, a quick skate, so I didn't establish my wall. I established my wall, I rotate it open to get a better peeling cut, and there we go. And once again, you can scrape the whole thing. Just understand with a normal scraper, after about 8 seconds, it's going to get dull. It's slowly stopping cutting. I'm pressing harder and harder and harder to do that. That is the advantage of carbide, is it stays sharper longer, but it's not going to stay sharp forever. So there we go. We have the 4 main types of cuts. that you see all over wood turning. The plane, the peel, the slice, and the scrape. And we did it in the three main categories of turning. We had spindle turning, we had end grain turning, and we had faceplate turning, often referred to as bowl turning. And we tried to explain that all of those were just the interaction between grain and the edges we were working, and pretty much all the edges were a variation of the skew. You can present that edge 4 different ways, so that you can plane, peel, slice, or cut. Now there were some advantages to having the curved tools in that they were like a skew at multiple different angles at the same time, so that you could slice and peel, slice and plane, or plane and then move into a slice all at the same time or in the same movement. All of those really do give you a smoother end result because you can manipulate them so all the time you are cutting supported fibers and avoiding the unsupported fibers that give us the nasty tear out. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please like, favorite, subscribe, do all those social medias. Understand that this is kind of a value for value proposition for me and a lot of other YouTubers. If you're gaining value out of it, maybe you could return a little. Visit our website, because I have swag, t-shirts, hats, with my little logo. I also sell a lot of my own woodworking and shop-made tools there, and all of those really do help subsidize this channel. Plus there are other ways you can help us out that you can find out on the website. But after all this, learning about the 4 cuts, the 3 different types of turning, how all that interacts with grain so that you can support those fibers and get a smooth result, I want you to remember the most important thing, that it is always worth the effort to learn, create, and share it with others. So y'all be safe, have fun, get out in the shop, and make a mess.